Hey, welcome everybody. I think we're good. Recording is on. Thanks everybody for joining me today, May 8th, 2024. And I think we'll get going. So the reason for this topic, this came up in a question which I didn't get to last time. And by the way, I think last time, last Wednesday, I had said I was going to do a garden tour today, but that the let's just say the filming didn't happen. So hopefully next week, although I guess I can't promise that, but that's the goal. So in the questions last week, one of the ones that I didn't get to was the final one, which is, what is your opinion on hormone replacement therapy for treating perimenopause symptoms and preventing future menopause-related conditions like weight gain and osteoporosis? So I think this is a fairly common question that people are wondering about. So I thought I would take a good look at this subject. Now, I think the way that I'm going to approach this to those of you who've been listening to me will sound very familiar, because those of you who have learned about the virus, let's just say hoax, have discovered that the only way to, to really rationally have a conversation about such a topic as viruses or nuclear atoms or hormones is to start at the beginning. And the beginning means, is there even such a thing as a hormone in living people or animals, maybe even plants? But let's just say we're talking about people today. So the first question is it true that we have clear scientific evidence for the existence of hormones in intact living people? Now, like you can remember, if you probably the first time you heard this, like, is there such a thing as a virus? A lot of people's reaction is, what a ridiculous question. How can this crazy guy even be posing this? Of course, there's viruses. Of course, there's testosterone, insulin, cortisone, pregnenolone, estrogen, progesterone, DHEA. I could go on and on and on. How could you even question it? It's basically one of the foundations of modern science and medicine. What do you mean? You know, do these actual chemicals exist in intact living people? But it's the same question, and we found a surprising answer with viruses. So let's see what we find with this. Now, the first thing I would say is, if you happen to bring this up in a conversation with somebody, um, you will get a lot of different responses, as I have in the past few weeks in looking into this. So one of them, of course, is that's a crazy thing to look into it. It's settled science. Everybody believes it. Uh, you know, the overwhelming majority of doctors and scientists know there's, hormones in living people. So, of course, then I always ask them, what percentage of doctors or scientists have to believe that that's true in order for it to be true? And I always hope that they'll come up with a number like, well, if 98% believe that it's true, then it must be true. So I say, so if 97% believe it's true and 3% don't, that means it's false. So that's ridiculous. Obviously, consensus has nothing to do with fact. We all know that by now. So the next thing people will say is, Well, but we give people testosterone and estrogen, and that's really what this question is based on. We give them insulin. These are hormones. We give them prednisone, cortisone, and then more enlightened doctors and naturopaths, a big part of their practice, in fact, some of them, their entire practice is basically giving people bioidentical hormones. Now, in order for there to be a bioidentical hormone, there has to be a hormone in you to which that chemical that you're giving them can be identical to. That should be obvious. So let me just point out that there is an obvious fallacy in giving somebody a chemical as proof or even evidence that that chemical exists in the living person in that exact form is obviously incorrect. If it was correct, then if somebody didn't feel good or was depressed or sad and you gave them cocaine and they felt better, I've never done that, but I've heard that that's how it works, at least temporarily. That obviously proves that the reason people are sad or depressed or not feeling well is because they have a cocaine deficiency. So in the comments and counter arguments, which I'm sure there will be many of, the argument that, but how can you say we don't have estrogen? Because if you give somebody a chemical called estrogen, it has an effect, even a predictable effect, and that proves that we must have estrogen, and that is actually totally incorrect. All it proves is that chemicals have effects, and it has effect that's similar to the next question or the next issue, which is nobody is saying that ovaries, testicles, pancreas, thyroid, hypothalamus, pituitary, thymus, all these gland producing or so-called hormone producing glands don't have an effect in living people or don't exist. Obviously, there's a pancreas. And obviously, if you take somebody's pancreas out, they get a certain set of symptoms. If you take people's testicles out, they get a certain set of symptoms. There's a sort of pattern recognition going on. If you take somebody's ovaries out, both of them, you get a certain set of symptoms quickly. That does not prove that the mechanism by which it does that is through making a hormone, i.e., a chemical from that gland. All you know is that the gland has an effect. And if you have a dysfunction or remove it or chemically ablate it or interfere with it or it's over-functioning, you will have a set of symptoms. This was obviously recognized in Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine and every traditional medical scheme that had nothing to do with these so-called hormones. They just recognized that these were what they would call sort of energy centers or chakras, and that they were this places in our bodies where a certain kind of energy collected and was even sort of emanated into the body, and there was no chemical proposed as part of that. The next thing I would say about this whole process is it's interesting how, in some ways, degrading it is to think about that these effects from these centers, otherwise they were called chakras or energy centers, only has an effect through these chemical hormones. It's a very reductionist, materialistic way of thinking. And you even hear people saying things like, well, you have this woman and she gave birth to a baby, and then she has a release of oxytocin, and it's the chemical oxytocin that makes her bond or fall in love with her baby, and that whatever she would see if first, if she had this burst of oxytocin that would create this bonding effect. So in other words, the entire relationship between a mother and a newborn baby is because of this chemical called oxytocin. I would love to see the proof of that. And again, I would love to see that proven, and not by giving somebody oxytocin and seeing whether they have a bonding effect. In fact, I actually doubt that that would happen, but I would love to see give a woman some oxytocin and blindfolded, and then give her a frog and see if she falls in love with the frog. And I actually doubt that would happen. So that's a very degrading, materialistic, reductionist view of the world, to think that this entire bonding experience that a mother has with the baby is only because of a chemical, which, as we'll see, it's very difficult to prove that chemical is even there. So the next thing I want to say, which is a more of a general comment, and this is something that also we encountered with virology, and we'll encounter it in many more places as time goes on, is that broadly speaking, there's two distinct ways of knowing something. And I'm using knowing something as opposed to believing something. And the first and obvious way, how do I know that there's a nail clippers? That's what that's called. It's because I have a sensory experience. In fact, I have multiple sensory experiences of this thing called a nail clipper. Now, I know people could get into a whole metaphysical argument on the whole nature of reality and is it all a simulation? And I don't really have much use for that or patience with that. As far as I can see, we live in a physical world and we experience that through our senses. And the first way that nobody could convince me that there isn't such a thing as a nail clipper, because I have it in my hand, I can see it, I can feel it, I can use it. It's a useful item to me. And as far as I can see, there's no argument to say that it doesn't exist. Now, it is true that your senses can be deceiving. So you could be sitting in your backyard and you see something, you say, wow, there's a UFO flying over there. And then the next day you find out that they were having a Frisbee tournament in your neighbor's yard. So it's always good to check your sense impressions with other people, and maybe even check them with yourself at different times and see if you can have, if you hear it and see it, and whether other people hear and see the same things. That's a sort of useful guide to see whether you're hallucinating or making it up or otherwise somewhat delusional. The other thing is there is a long history among people of trying to expand their capacity of sensory experience. Goethe talked about this, and that's something that I would say we all should be, to a certain extent, engaged in. And I'm not talking about anything particularly esoteric here. When I look out in my yard, I see green. But when an artist comes and looks at the yard, they talk about the many shades of green, which I don't even really see. I see them a little bit when they're pointed out. And that's only because this artist has trained themselves in how to see in a more nuanced way. And that, I would say, is one of the tasks for each of us. Now, people also do that with various substances, typically called plant medicines or hallucinogenics. And again, that's not something that I have basically any experience with. And I would be careful with that. But it is a way that people throughout history have used to expand their sensory experience. So they see and hear and maybe feel and taste and touch things that they don't ordinarily do. But again, I would caution that when people do that, and I'm not saying that people should or shouldn't do it. I'm just saying that when you do that, you should check yourself. Is this what I'm experiencing while I'm in this situation? Is that something other people experiences? Is it real? How can I check myself to know that I can rely on this? But otherwise, it can be obviously a very helpful and interesting way of expanding your senses. You can also do that with meditation and thinking exercises and just being determined to think more or see more clearly and keep checking yourself, etc. So that's the one category of how we know. The other category is there's things that we want to experience, which we have no sensory observation at all, at least in the usual way with our usual senses. We don't see it, we don't hear it, we don't taste it, smell it, anything. Now, that obviously doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. That would be an incorrect assumption. But that's where the principles that Harold Hillman talked about, if you're going to claim that something exists which you have no experience of, in other words, this paperclip is made of iron. I have no experience of that directly. I hear that it's certain people have done certain experiments and come out with that conclusion. I know a frog is real, but I don't know that their muscles are made of myosin and actin. When you get into a conclusion like that in an intact frog, their muscles, which is something you can experience, you can even, if you want, and I wouldn't advise this because it's mean, cut open the frog and see the muscles and see it twitching and see it contracting and relaxing and all that. So you can get an idea from your sensory experience what a muscle does. To say that it's made of actin and myosin means you have to do certain steps. And here's another principle which I want everybody to think about. And so if you're in a conversation about hormones, I would say this is a hard and fast rule. If somebody claims that something exists and it's not something that a common person has a sensory experience of, in other words, they can't see it, feel it, taste it, smell it, etc., then if they don't know how that thing was arrived at being proven to exist, then they do not belong in the conversation. In other words, if you're going to tell me a virus exists and you don't know how a virologist allegedly finds a virus and proves it exists, then you essentially know nothing about the subject and you can dismiss that person's opinion right from the start because they have no knowledge of the subject. And so anytime if you're in a conversation with your doctor or a scientist and you say, well, what do you think about insulin? Do we actually have this chemical called insulin in us, or testosterone or estrogen? And they say, of course, and we use it all the time. We already know that using a chemical is not the same as saying that we know that it exists. That would be a fallacious argument. Chemicals have an effect. We're not disputing that. Glands have an effect. We're not disputing that, or I'm not disputing that. What I'm questioning is just the simple question of, has it been proven that the reason why ovaries work or testicles work or pancreas work is because they secrete a chemical called a hormone, which you can find in an intact person. If that person doesn't know how they came up with that chemical, in other words, the method section, then they do not belong in the conversation because they're ignorant about the subject. And I would absolutely stand on that. And that's exactly the problem that we get into with virology. that these people who are writing Substacks and arguments about, of course, there's a virus. Turns out when you ask them, they have no idea, and I mean no idea, how anybody would go about finding a virus. So we're going to try to correct that now and not be so ignorant and ask the question, okay, and there is a claim out there. And again, this is another principle that we use all the time. We don't have to have an alternative explanation for why testicles work or why estrogen given exogenously, so-called bioidentical or hormone replacement therapy, works. We're asking the question because there's a claim that living people make these hormones and they have these effects, and the hormones exist in the normal situation of the person. And we're going to try to find out, is there evidence to support that claim? Just to put a simple example, if you don't have an experience and somebody says, I just found a three-headed fish in the pond, obviously that would be something that nobody or you haven't seen. And so the obvious question you would say is either, can you show it to me? Or how did you find this three-headed fish? And for some reason, that's not the first question. If you say, I have SARS-CoV-2 or chickenpox virus, you don't ask the person, so how did you go about finding this SARS-CoV-2 or chickenpox virus? That should be the first question that's asked. And if there's no answer, if the person doesn't know, which 99% of the people will have no idea, again, they are not part of the conversation. The other thing that I'll say is, this is an example looking at hormones of how, unfortunately, so-called science, or actually pseudoscience, works, is that they make a claim, the claim gets disproven, and then instead of saying, yeah, I guess that original claim was either false or certainly not proven, they go on and make a new statement, a new principle that supports the original claim. And until that gets disproven, which it eventually always does, and then they go on and make a new principle and a new principle, etc. So an example of that, obviously, is when we first said there were viruses, and if you got exposed to a virus, you got sick because viruses made people sick. And then, of course, they noticed that not everybody who got exposed to the virus got sick. And so that falsified that claim. Again, it doesn't matter if you know why or why not somebody gets sick. So then you have to keep the story going. So you say, well, those people have a good immune system, or they have immunity to the virus. So that keeps the story going until you investigate the immune system and immunity and find out it's also a bunch of bull. And so then they make a new story about epitopes and immunoblot assays and all these things to try to confuse you. It's basically, you get into W.C. Fields territory of, if you can't dazzle them with brilliance, you baffle them with bullshit. So then you get deeper and deeper into it. And the hope is that you forget the original question and that becomes clear. So an example of that with hormones is they discovered this hormone, one of the most famous ones, called insulin, supposedly made by certain cells in the pancreas. And they said that if you didn't make enough of this insulin, you got diabetes. And so for years, and we're talking then because there essentially was no what we call now type 1 diabetes. So these were all so-called type 2 diabetics. And we said they didn't have enough insulin, so we gave them insulin. And over the years, we did this for 50 years, and we found out it didn't work. And then they find out, oh, well, the problem is they don't have an insulin deficiency. They actually have too much insulin, but they're insulin resistant. So the cells are making thick cell membranes which keep the insulin from driving the sugar into the cell. And so it's not that they have too much insulin, they have too little insulin, and there's some other problem, and that keeps the story going that you actually have insulin. So the other thing I would say in the beginning is, as we'll find out, the story is pretty complicated, and the repercussions of giving a chemical that you don't make, that is not part of your physiology. Here I'm going to make a probably overly blanket statement. While there may be some positive benefits, it will always, and I would emphasize, always have negative or so-called untoward effects. So you give insulin and you make the person gain more weight, and you have all kinds of other metabolic disturbances. You give people testosterone, even so-called bioidentical one, which we'll see in a minute is basically a joke, and then your testicles shrink. And you give people estrogen, even so-called bioidentical one, and then you give them breast cancer and other thing because you gave them a chemical poison. So that is the practical repercussion of making this mistake of, do these effects from the glands, are they mediated through these chemicals called hormones? So let's get into now the question, so how do they actually prove that these hormones exist? So I'm going to share my screen here. The first one, I couldn't resist. There is a new study that shows, that confirms the germ theory. It's actually based on duct tape. So you can see this was a recent publication in a science journal showing how they held the evidence that the germ theory is actually accurate. Here's another one I found that has nothing to do with the subject, but it turns out it's an interesting thing, because when you go back to these old papers, so this is May 1938, we tend to think that the scientists and doctors were all uniform in what they thought. And this is right before, this is 50 years after polio was present in the United States. This is one of the most important medical journals of that time in 1938. You would think that they already had the facts of this. But if you look here, for the premises are, we're not sure whether we call polio is one disease or a group or maybe more. We don't know if it's new or ancient. We don't understand the nature of the causative factors. Our knowledge of the pathogenesis, the cause, is incomplete and indefinite. The geographic factors are incomplete. We don't know whether it's an infection or whether the disease is infectious. We don't know whether it's communicable from person to person. And the measures that we're taking for prevention and control are unreasonable, unwarranted, futile, and in some cases dangerous. Where have we heard that before? So this is not new, and that was the state of the art about polio right few years before the so-called vaccine was discovered. And I just want to point out that the leaders in the so-called alternative health movement are in functional medicine, and including people like Mercola, who I know I pick on a lot for this. But here was a recent article. I mean, I don't read it, but somebody sent me this, that claiming there's 4 hormones that most adults can benefit from: progesterone, T3, DHEA, and pregnenolone, and that most people who aren't particularly well would do well to take these 4 chemicals basically all of their adult life. And that's nonsense. So what do we mean by a chemical? So, or what, let's take just anyone, because the story of all the hormones you'll see is the same. So we're talking about this. Now, the first thing is, this is basically a cartoon, or a artist schematic drawing, or I don't even think this is computer. So this is what we're talking about. So inside us, we got this thing with the lines, and sometimes they draw it with the double bond thing, which looks like a cell phone to see how much power or how much whatever connection you have on your phone. So they draw it like that. And so the first question to ask yourself is, has anybody ever seen this thing, this structure in a living person? And I think you can answer that for yourself. But then the next thing I did was say, okay, well, let me see a picture of that thing. And here I got some X-ray crystallography pictures of, I think this was testosterone. So turns out if you look in your skin, in your gonads and in your blood, you got these ribbon things with little nets all over like this and little balls. This is what apparently they're claiming this thing looks like. Now, that I think is questionable. Like, how do they know that? And is that really what it looks like in you? And there, you would need to know the steps in order to say, how did you arrive at this picture? And does that have any relationship with what you actually found? The next thing is, and this I also got this from a Telegram group that I'm with. I don't want to say who did it because I don't have permission to do that, but they definitely helped me with this. And I just took 2 of these. So what we're doing now is, remember I said, if you don't know how this was found and proven to exist and be part of the normal makeup of a human being, then you don't know whether you can answer that question. And as Hillman of whether this thing exists in intact human beings while they're alive. And as Hillman said, when you go from sensory experience, I can see this nail clippers. We don't have that with hypothalamic releasing hormones of human origin. This is a paper describing the first isolation. In other words, how they found this hypothalamic releasing hormones in a human being. How you find something has a huge impact on what you find. That should be obvious and should be one of the foundational principles of science. The second principle is, if you do something, i.e. mix it with an acid or freeze it or put it on an electrical grid like electrophoresis, then you have to do a control to know that mixing it with a certain chemical didn't create a new chemical or a new substance that wasn't there in the first place. And this is going to be one of the most important things I say in this whole presentation. There are things which there is no way to do a control. Hillman talked about that, and that is abundantly clear and obvious. In which case, the only rational, scientific, honest conclusion is we have no way of knowing whether our procedure created this chemical or whether it was there in the first place. Again, there are things which you cannot know whether they exist. You cannot find them except by doing procedures to them which may alter it, change it, or even make it appear where it wouldn't have otherwise. In order for you to know that it didn't do that, you need to have controlled that step. In other words, if you mix it with acetone, you've got to do a same procedure, everything the same, except don't mix it with acetone. And then if you say, but Tom, you idiot, Of course, you can't find it unless you mix it with acetone. And you can't prove to me that acetone didn't make something appear which wasn't there in the first place. Then if you're an honest person and an honest scientist, you have to admit that you have no proof that this thing exists. Having said that, let's look at how they found this. So here is the method section of how do you find human releasing hormones. So the ventral part is a certain part of the hypothalamus between the optic chiasm and mammillary bodies, including portions of the pituitary, removed from the brain during routine autopsies. These fragments weighed 400 to 1,000 milligrams and were obtained from unselected males and females, most of whom 50 to 80 years old. Time lapse of between 2 and 48 hours between death and excision of the tissue, after which excision was kept frozen until lyophilized, which I think is a sort of drying technique. So the first question is, so these are dead people, and they're dead anywhere between 2 hours and 2 days. That's a long time. So are you saying that nothing biochemically changed in these chemicals in their brain in this as a result of dying and a result of sitting around for 2 to 48 hours? Now, I'm not saying that they did and that the chemicals were made to appear, but it seems like you should have some sort of control for this, a control meaning obviously take it from a living person so that you're controlling for whether the death process itself changed what you're seeing. And again, if there's no way to do that, either because of humanitarian reasons or availability reasons, then you have to admit you don't know whether this dying changed the chemicals, because we can certainly look in the world and seeing trees die and frogs die and other things dying, and a lot of biochemical, or not biochemical, a lot of things change in them which wouldn't have changed otherwise if they were alive. So that's the first thing. So there were all 33, these things were carefully dried on a drying tray. The mean dry weight was 140 milligrams. The fragments were then defatted and extracted according to the following procedure, which was similar to what they did with pig hypothalamus. So they weighed 47.5 grams. They were carefully ground into a fine powder on dry ice using mortar and pestle. So again, did that change anything? There's no controls. There's no way to know. Then they add a few crystals of EDTA. That's a powerful chemical. They were added to the tissue during the grinding. Did that change it? We don't know. The powder was desiccated in a vacuum. Did that change it? And stirred for 2 hours with a liter of acetone, which is a very powerful chemical. So did washing something with a liter of acetone, a small powder, did that create something or change the chemical makeup or the composition? We don't know. Then it was filtered and washed on the filter with another liter and a liter of petroleum ether at 40 to 60 degrees. So this is hot ether from petroleum was mixed. Did that change it? We don't know. Traces of the solvent were again removed with a vacuum. Does that change it? We don't know. The dry material was then extracted with 2 nano something of acetic acid at 8 degrees. So now we got cold acid in addition to our hot acid and hot ether, etc. And it was centrifuged at 15,000 Gs for 60 minutes at 4 degrees. Does spinning something that fast at that cold change what you see, change the chemistry, change the configuration, change the arrangement, change those cartoon pictures that we saw? We don't know because there's no control. Then it was the extract was quickly heated So this is like what we went over with the PCR test. Apparently, freezing something and spinning it at 15,000 Gs and then heating it for 30 minutes at almost boiling point, 95 degrees centigrade, and then rapidly chill. That, of course, doesn't change anything. And I'd love to see you do that with a mouse or a frog. I actually wouldn't love to see you do it because I hate torturing animals. But see if anything changed in what they look like or any of their makeup because of that. Then the extract were recentrifuged at another 15,000 degrees for an hour, spinning something around at almost freezing temperatures that fast for an hour. And of course, that couldn't change anything. Then all these extracts were combined and dried, and then it was re-extracted with glacial acetic acid. That must be acetic acid from glaciers, which I know it isn't, but I don't know what that is, but it's some other powerful acid. This was performed 5 times with portions of 250 to 400 milliliters of acid. Then it was all combined and mixed with, got a powder, and it was then mixed with glass distilled water. And then you can go on, and then they put it in gel filtration, which uses some, that's probably just a density filtration. And then they compared the migration pattern of the bands that they get, and they excluded certain things. And you can go on. And then they do bioassays. And the only thing they could say as a control is, so they start with a actually dead person's hypothalamus. And the only control, which is similar to virology, they say, okay, here we put a basically a mucus from a sick person, and we don't know what's in there. We don't look for a virus. We put that on a cell culture, and that seems to speed up the death of the cell culture. And what do they use as a control? Even though they're say if you are looking for a virus, the virus has to be the independent variable. So you have to do the exact same thing without the virus. Here, instead, they just put saline or phosphate buffer or something. So you're leaving out all the different components. Here, they may do the whole thing starting with nothing, and then they don't get any chemicals in their filtration and in their gel and in their assays. And so that's the difference. And all that goes to show is there's no way to know that that hormone, that chemical, was present in the living person who's not even living in this, so they didn't even test that. And that any of these steps didn't find something which you either created or altered or something during this process. And what this means is the naturopathic and alternative and functional medicine claim that they're using bioidentical hormones is pure fantasy. Because unless you can prove the composition of this hormone, this chemical in the living person and not like this, then how could you possibly know that the chemical that you synthesized in a lab, this single chemical, could possibly be identical with something which you've never actually even shown to exist in a living person? Now, just to show you, this isn't just hormones. You do the same thing with basically any vitamin. So here's one with vitamin K1. Again, I got this from a Telegram group, and I don't want to say who it's from, and I don't even remember, and it doesn't matter, but I'm grateful that they're helping me with the research. Because the other thing that I found with this, if you go and looking up, which I did this week, okay, show me the original paper that isolated ascorbic acid, i.e., so-called vitamin C or vitamin D or vitamin A or retinol or estrogen or testosterone. Show me the original paper with the method section of how they did that, and they are extraordinarily difficult to find. And I don't know, a lot of them are old, of course, because somebody did it, and then from then on, well, somebody else did it, so they must be there. And so now we have the so-called chemistry, and nobody ever looks into or asks the question, how did they actually find this? Was it a proper scientific experiment? And was it any possibility that anything was changed in their procedure? And that never gets revisited. From then on, it becomes a fact. And then you have these so-called chemical formulas, i.e., cartoons, which supposedly depict the chemicals that are supposedly found in us. And here you can see the same thing with the elution of the vitamin. So how did they find the vitamin? Was dissolved in petroleum ether, really hot, to make a 2.2 to 5% solution. And then it was amount of solid was 1 part to 60 parts. Then the crystalline material was removed by filtration, and then it was allowed to flow. And then it was absorbed in 10% benzene in petroleum ether, and then 20% benzene in petroleum ether and acetone. And if you get a filter fraction, and then this was distilled, and then you assay it for this chemical and the activity of the chemical. And it was interesting to me when I was looking into this and asking chemists to tell me how they knew that this substance, this chemical, was actually present, or even this principle is present in the living thing. And the one chemist I talked to said he spent 40 years studying the active ingredient in pepper plants and working with the active ingredient and isolating it. And I said, well, how did you know that chemical was actually present in the pepper plant when it was alive? He said it was easy. We just took the pepper and ate it. And if it tasted hot, we knew that it had what we were looking for in it. Now, again, I'm not saying that there aren't things in pepper plants and there aren't things in your hypothalamus, and there may be proteins and there may be other things that when you put them through this procedure, they get different substances, different chemicals than if you put your pancreas or your testicles or your ovaries or your thymus or any other part of you. These are obviously different glands. They have different structure. They're made of different components. They have a different energy print. And so it's not surprising that you put them through different procedures and they get different chemicals. Another thing that's very interesting about this is the formula for getting ascorbic acid or vitamin K1 or estrogen or progesterone or thyroid hormone are always different. So you don't use the same formula from different organs and get the same things. And that also adds another confounding variable, that each one has its own particular formula, and that's the only way you can find it. And nobody, again, I keep beating on this, ever asked the question, did that procedure make the creation of this thing come to be? And let me just show you another thing really quickly. Oh, well, maybe I won't. So this was a paper that I got with the isolation and identification of testosterone. You can see the reference there. You can find it, and you're going to probably have to take my word for it. But it was exactly the same: hot acids, ethers, acetone, removing testicles from dead people. Same thing, same steps. No controls. no evidence that you can actually find this thing in intact people. So my conclusion is, again, there is no actual scientific evidence that any of these hormones exist as we are told in living people. That puts into doubt for me whether the function of the glands works through these chemicals. And it doesn't mean that I know how a gland actually works, but I can only say that it's very interesting that in the real medicines of the past, Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, these were considered the energy centers of the body. And that if you had some disturbance of the energy flow, either through wrong living or being poisoned or wrong thinking or something to do with your connection with the world outside of us, or the way that you have come to see the world, or lots of other factors, you can end up with a defect or a deficiency or an overactivity of one of these energy centers, which then creates certain patterns of activity, which we have come to call hypothyroidism, or the symptoms that we call menopause. Now, if you boil that down into a single chemical and make the unfounded claim that you're giving a bioidentical, i.e., the identical chemical which you never found, to the person, what you will always see happen is some so-called positive effects, like you may have less hot flashes temporarily. You also seem to inevitably make the dysfunction or underfunction of that gland worse. Every time you give prednisone, you make the function of your own adrenal gland worse. Every time you give somebody chemical thyroid on the unfounded assumption that you're giving a bioidentical supplementation, as is recommended by Mercola and other functional doctors, I can pretty much guarantee that you will make the function of wherever that hormone is alleged to come from, in this case, your thyroid, if it's thyroxine, you will make that function worse. And now you're in a situation where, in order to feel at all normal, you obviously have to keep taking this non-bioidentical chemical, probably then for the rest of your life. And that's exactly what we see, rather than doing what healing is meant to be, which is identifying that in your situation, you have some sort of energetic defect or dysfunction or a certain pattern that suggests that your center, called the adrenal gland, or your hypothalamus, or your thyroid gland, or your ovaries, or your testicles, is either underfunctioning or overfunctioning, and figuring out what in your life, what in your food, what in your movement, what in your exercise, what in your sun exposure, what in your earth exposure, what in your thoughts, what in the traumas to your life has led you to this outcome. In other words, what is your story, which is, by the way, we've actually gone over this with all the practitioners at the New Biology Clinic, and they all absolutely get this. This is a degrading, reductionist, materialistic view of a man or woman to say your problem can be boiled down to a deficiency of this chemical, which I don't even know if most people who claim this, they don't even know how anybody went about finding this chemical in the first place. And I just went over that, and you can see what a profoundly anti-scientific process this is. So the simple answer to your question, I never, as far as I remember, gave anybody any kind of chemical, hormone, bioidentical or otherwise, in all my years of practice. I don't remember ever giving that once. Occasionally, I would have people who I would identify a thyroid uh, dysfunction. I would have them eat thyroid glands, and usually you have to do that with like so-called supplements. But the supplements had to be the best quality, uh, basically nothing but dehydrated or freeze dried or some minimally processed gland from an animal, which is the sort of traditional way of improving the underfunction of a certain gland, i.e., energy center. Otherwise, it was the same process of finding out what they're eating, how they're living, et cetera, that we keep going over, using different plants and different energy interventions to try to stimulate that function back to normal, because that's really where healing comes about, not through the erroneous application of making up a story about some chemical that you can't even prove exists and giving that and then claiming that you're doing holistic, alternative, or somehow functional medicine. So I think hopefully that answers the question, and I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of interesting comments. I just want to be clear, when you make a comment, the comment needs to be about how it was found. I am not interested in, well, Uncle Fred took testosterone and he felt a lot better, so that proves testosterone was in Uncle Fred. That that's just not the way to think. And hopefully we've been through that, and so we don't have to deal with that. And again, everybody, thanks for joining me. I hope this was interesting, and we'll see if we can get the garden video going next week. All right, take care.